Welcome back to another Crusty Cravings video. I'm Hannah and I'm a sourdough microbaker in Fort Myers, Florida. I've been doing it for about 8 months, but I've been making sourdough for over 2.5 years. I'm really passionate about helping others perfect their sourdough bread because I struggled for over a year and a half before it clicked and I started digging into the science. Some of the most common questions I get asked are around starter health, starter maintenance, and bulk fermentation. So today I wanted to focus on starter health and starter maintenance. So what is sourdough starter? Sourdough starter is just a mixture of naturally fermented flour and water. It's a leavening agent that makes baked goods rise, aka wild yeast. It has its own culture of microorganisms that are alive and perform their own biological activity. So in order to keep it alive, you have to feed it, just like any other living organism. When you feed your starter a ratio of fresh flour and fresh water, it will start to grow as it feeds. The bacteria within wild yeast feeds on the sugars found in flour, and after it has consumed all of the food it can consume, it will start to become hungry and fall back down to the original feed line. You can see here my starter rose all the way up to here and has fallen now back down to the original feed line. It is now hungry and acidic. Some of the bacteria died, some of it's dormant, and when I feed it fresh flour and fresh water again, it will continue to grow and expand in volume and create carbon dioxide that will be responsible for lifting your bread. This is why we have to discard some of the old starter or the old bacteria and feed it fresh flour and fresh water to keep it healthy, alive, and active. An important thing to note about sourdough starter is it does the best in temperatures of 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you live in a really cold place or your house is set to a very cold temperature and you notice that your starter is becoming sluggish, there are a couple things that you can do. You can put your starter in the microwave with a bowl of boiling water. You're not actually going to microwave it. It's just to create a sauna effect and create that warmth and humidity that your starter thrives on. You can also do the same thing in an oven where you just keep the oven light on and the door closed so that it creates enough warmth to give your starter enough activity to be happy and active and growing. I've also seen that people will buy a seedling mat or a warming mat and are able to either control or just keep the temperature at a really warm place so that the starter is thriving and happy in that temperature. A lot of people have a proofing setting on their oven that they can use or a proofing box that they actually buy for their sourdough starter so they can control the thermostat and keep it at the ideal temperature. You don't have to get that granular or that nitty-gritty, but I do recommend keeping it in the warmest place in your house and feeding with warm water if you live in a cold place. I've said it before, I'll say it again, you do not have to feed your sourdough starter every day in order to have a healthy, happy, and active sourdough starter. I typically feed mine 3 to 4 days out of the week, and the remaining days it lives in the refrigerator. I've left my starter in the fridge for 10 days, a month, 2 months, sometimes even 6 months. I've even froze my starter and it has come back to life. You'd be surprised how powerful wild yeast is and how resilient it is. It will take a different amount of time to revive it after the refrigerator. Once you go to feed it again, it may take 3 to 5 times of feeding in order to get it back up to peak health, but it will come back to life because sourdough starters are resilient. I have a couple of examples of recent times where my mom has had to revive her sourdough starter or I've had to revive it for her. When we first get it out of the fridge after it's been in there for say 4 to 6 months, it will have a thick black layer of hooch on the top typically. Hooch can be many different colors. It can be yellow, black, gray, slightly purple, slightly pink, but the actual starter should not have any pink or orange streaks in it. If you see that, that is bacteria and it needs to be thrown away. You do not want to get sick from your sourdough starter. It's better to just start over in that case If you see like fuzzy green or any kind of mold, you also want to throw it away. It's contaminated and you cannot use it. But if it is just a thin layer of hooch on the top, that is basically just alcohol that has been created based off of the fermentation process of it sitting in the fridge for so long. It has consumed all of the food that it can consume, and it has now started to separate from the rest of the starter. Hooch is just a sign that your starter is extremely hungry and needs to be revived. When I first get it out of the fridge and it has a thick layer of hooch on it, I will typically only take about 50 grams of that starter and feed it a 1:1:1 feeding ratio, which is just equal parts starter to flour to water in grams. That will give it a boost to revive it, so to speak. Sometimes I let the starter come to room temperatures, but more often than not, I just feed it cold, and I feed it with warm water, and I stick it in the warmest place in the house. I will tend to see activity really fast because my starter is well established and very active in general. So I'll see that activity really quickly, and I'll feed it up to 5 times before I start baking with it again. I just want to see it come back to its full health before I start baking. I know I said that you don't have to feed your starter every day, but if you're seeing that your starter is sluggish and you're used to only feeding it, say, once to twice per week, it might be good just to get it out of the fridge, feed it every day, every 12 hours with a 1:1:1 to a 5:5:5 ratio, just to give it a boost and see if that can bring it back to life and create more activity. Because if you keep your starter in the fridge for a long time and are only maintaining it weekly, you may see a decline in activity, which is normal. Microorganisms need to be fed to keep them alive at the end of the day. And so every now and then I will keep it on my counter for an entire week or 5 days and feed it 1 to 2 times per day just to bring it back to life. A lot of people will slide into my DMs saying that their starter is sluggish, that they're seeing minimal activity. Half the time it is the warmth of your home or the warmth of your environment or the temperature of water that you're feeding it. But sometimes it could be just a lack of giving it high protein flours. I encourage people to throw in some whole wheat flour, some spelt flour, some rye flour, along with AP flour or whatever you're used to feeding it with, just to give it a boost. Whenever the bran and the germ are still intact within your flour, the microorganisms and the bacteria in your starter just thrive on that. So that can bring it back to life faster or create more activity if you see it being sluggish. A lot of people are taught to feed their starter with a 1:1:1 feeding ratio, which is equal parts starter, flour, and water in grams. And that is the bare minimum your starter needs to thrive. It will rise the fastest and fall the fastest with that feeding ratio, and it easily becomes acidic. So if you see that your starter is becoming more powerful and stronger and rising and falling faster, and you continue to feed with that ratio, your starter can become acidic. And I encourage people to up their ratio to a 1:2:2, a 1:3:3, a 1:5:5, just to give it more food for it to be happy for longer before becoming acidic. Because when you see your starter fall and you leave it flat for a long time, say 12 to 24 hours, a lot of that bacteria will have died. Even if a small portion is dormant, it can create a sluggish starter. So I always encourage you to kind of switch up what you're doing. Don't always go with what you were taught initially. Challenge the status quo and see what happens. I noticed that my starter thrives with a 1:5:5 to a 1:10:10 feeding ratio, and it typically is good for an entire 24 hours before I have to revive it. So just keep that in mind. I've also heard from other people that have used tap water that tap water can work for a long time. Maybe it works for 6 months. And then all of a sudden they put something in the water, or there's chlorine or bacteria in the water, and all of a sudden their starter's activity just plummets. So one thing I always encourage is to use spring water or filtered water, or just something that you don't risk having chlorine or any kind of bacteria within. The other issue I've seen in Facebook groups but not experienced personally is Kahm yeast. It is a beige, white, webby-like structure on the top of your starter. Apparently it is a defense mechanism for your starter to protect itself, especially if it's extremely hungry or if it's been closed off from oxygen for a long period of time. It is basically just protecting itself. It is very invasive. I've heard it's also very bitter. So even if you take a very small portion of your starter and try to revive it and scrape off the Kahm yeast, it tends to come back. So in these circumstances, I always encourage people to have extra discard in the fridge and a dehydrated starter that you can revive in 5 days. It's actually very easy to dehydrate your starter. All I do is take a baking sheet and put parchment paper on the top. I take active starter and pour that over the parchment paper, and I take a spatula and just smooth it out very thinly and let it air dry at room temperature for about 12 to 24 hours. And after it has dried, it will start flaking off of the parchment paper, and you just take that, put it in a blender and form it into a powder, put it in a Ziploc bag, an airtight bag, and there you have dehydrated starter to revive if you ever have an issue. Or say there is a natural disaster like a hurricane and you lose power for weeks and weeks. You have dehydrated starter in your cabinet, ready to be refreshed whenever. So in summary, wild yeast is just naturally fermented flour and water. It needs to be fed to keep it alive and happy and active. The more you feed it in temperatures of 75 to 85 degrees Fahrenheit, the happier and more active it is. If you put it in the refrigerator, it does not kill your starter. It makes it go dormant. It slows down the feeds. It doesn't completely kill it. Hooch does not kill your starter. Kahm yeast is bad. Bacteria is bad. Mold is bad. But most things can be revived if it's simply a sluggish starter. It just needs warmth. It just needs to be fed. It just needs high protein flours. And with the proper care, you can bring any starter back to life. So I hope all of these tips help. Please let me know if you have any other starter related questions. I really nerd out to this kind of thing, so I'm happy to answer them. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you liked this content, please subscribe. I plan to do longer and longer content and more educational content, more recipes, more tutorials, and just anything that would be helpful for a sourdough beginner or someone who's advanced. If you like this content, please follow me on my other social channels at Crusty Cravings by Hannah. You can find me on TikTok and Instagram. Thank you and have a blessed day.